Shabbat Shalom. So raise your hand if you've been listening to the podcast that Rabbi Schwartz and I have been making on the weekly Parsha. Okay. Okay, good.
I'm surprised it's so many.
I know. We sort of entertain each other and ourselves, but I'm glad that, yeah, exactly. So we spent a lot of time this week talking about the sort of initial parts of Yitro and Yitro's visit to Moshe, and then we got towards the end, and Jeremy, our communications person, Jeremy Silbert, who's really extraordinary, he sort of did like the rap sign, and Rabbi Schwartz was like, we didn't even get to the 10 Commandments. So I thought today that I would do, hey Rob, I thought today, it's like perfect timing, right? I thought today that I would talk for a short bit about Yitro's visit to Moshe, but then I actually wanted to focus, because I remembered that voice in my head, which is like, we didn't even get to talk about the 10 Commandments. I wanted to talk about one commandment in particular, which is the commandment of honoring one's parents. So I'm going to start with the Yitro part, and then I'm going to go to the next. So there are a couple pieces that I feel like are really important, both in their story, but also in their messaging, that come from the beginning of the Parsha of Yitro. And in particular, we all know the story. We read it this morning. Yitro, Moshe's father-in-law, comes from the very beginning of the Parsha, and he comes to visit Moshe. And he brings Tzipporah, Moshe's wife, and their 2 children with him. And we know from the very, very beginning that Yitro has already heard of all of the extraordinary things that have happened to the Jewish people. That's the starting point. So he comes out, he actually sends word in advance, which is a nice parent-in-law thing to do, right? He doesn't surprise them with the visit, he sends word in advance. And then Yitro comes, and he and Moshe have the opportunity to connect. They go into the tent together, they catch up on each other's lives, and we see that everything seems to be going really well, that Yitro is very happy for his son-in-law and for the Jewish people, even though he is not a part of the Jewish people. He feels grateful to God and to their God for all of the miracles that have happened thus far. And then we see something really interesting, which is that, it's the next morning, they wake up. Yitro, I feel like, sleeps in a little. He's a little older. He's had probably his coffee. He goes out to see what Moshe, his son-in-law, is up to, and he says to him, like, wow, what is this thing that you're doing? And then I want to actually go into the text because I think the words are so important here. He says here, I hear you, Rabbi Zaslow. She says, too much. It's too much. So, which is exactly right. So the next day, when Moshe's father-in-law sees how much he was doing for the people, he says, Mahadavar Hazeh, what is this thing that you're doing to the people, right? It's an interesting thing. Le'am, like, what is this thing that you're doing to the people? Not for the people, but what is this thing that you're doing to the people? Which is an interesting thing because he seems to be serving them and doing it pretty well, but Yitro's going to have a different story. He says, why? He says, Madua, like, why atayoshev levadecha? Why are you working all alone? V'chol ha'am nitzav, and all of the community is standing around and waiting in front of you from min boker ad erev, like from the morning until the night. And Moshe replies, it's because the people are coming to me to ask about God. And when they have a dispute, they also come before me, and I decide when they're having issues with each other, and I let them know the teachings of God. And Moshe's father-in-law, Yitro, says to him, and this is, I think, such an interesting thing. He says, Lo tov hadavar asher ata oseh, which is this thing that you're doing isn't good. And we've heard something being lo tov before. Can anyone remember all the way back to the Garden of Eden? Right? We see that God looks down on Adam, and he says, actually, even before that, God looks down on Adam, and he says, it's not good, before Eve is even created, it's not good. Right? It's lo tov for people to be alone. And then God creates a partner, Ezer Kenegdo, a partner for Adam. And so this is the second time that we read the words lo tov. It's not good. And when you think about it, both of those lo tovs come, one from God, one from Yitro, in the context of people or a person trying to do life alone. And so we have this really important message, which is trying to do life alone isn't good. The first time it's in regard to a partnership, but the second time it's actually in the context of work. Even there, when you're trying to serve the people, when you're trying to do your work, it's lo tov to do it alone, and the question is why? And if you still have your Chumashim, you can see on page 434, Yitro says to him, why? He says, because navol tibol, gam ata gam ha'am hazeh, right? Like, you're going to surely wear yourself out, you and the people as well. Meaning, if you try to do too much and you try to do it all alone, you're going to exhaust yourself, but also you're going to think that it's only you that's exhausted, but it's also going to be bad for them. They're going to have to suffer too. Why? Because the task is too heavy for you. You can't do it alone. And then, like any good father-in-law or professional coach would do, says, here's an idea. And then he tells them what to do. He says, you represent the people before God, and then you empower them. And then, if you look on page 435, if you have it near you, he actually says who he should put in charge of the things, right? Who he should delegate to. And he says, you should seek out from among all the people, capable people who fear God. If anyone's reading along, you'll see that it might say men, but it could also be inclusive. So I'm going to say capable people who fear God. Trustworthy people who spurn ill-gotten gain. Have them do this sort of work that you're doing, or much of it, and then the big cases you adjudicate. And Moses does that. He chooses capable people from the people of Israel, and he appoints them heads of the people. Okay, by the way, it's actually a really important thing when we're thinking about who we choose to govern. Yitro is telling us the kind of people that we should be looking for. Capable people, people who spurn ill, right? Like who have good intentions, people that are trustworthy. I say nothing more. But I think, and this is why I wanted to touch on these two pieces, and then we're going to go to honoring your parents. I feel like within that, there's probably something in those two pieces of Torah that every person here struggles with in some way. And so I just want to ask, because today is really like, I think Yitro reminds us, like, we're not alone, and we shouldn't live as if we were, right? Even if you don't have a partner, even if you've lost the person who you usually were used to count on as being your person, the truth is that we're a part of a community. And so what I want to ask you to think about is, if you were going to take a message from this part of the parsha that we read, where is it that you need to do some work in your own life, right? Is it recognizing, right, that, you're trying to do too much alone as a human being? Is it in your professional life that you're taking on too much and the system doesn't work to serve you or the people? Or maybe is it that you don't ask for help enough? You don't reach out to others to let them know how they might help you, or maybe you don't necessarily have that network in place where you help each other. So just some things to think about from the beginning of this parasha. And of course, we can also think of leadership too, but I promised you we were going to do a little bit of study on the Ten Commandments. So we're going to do some study now on honoring one's parents. Okay, why do we do this study on honoring your parents? She's trying her best, it's okay. Okay, so the text that I have this morning, we're going to do a little bit of chavruta on. I don't know if we're going to go sort of with the people by your side, or we'll do it out loud. We'll make that decision in a minute. We learn in the parsha that we read this week the idea of honoring your father and your mother, And we actually learn from this parsha why, and it says that you may long endure on the land that the Lord your God is assigning to you. So we see that there are consequences if we don't, and there are consequences if we do. So from the Talmud in Kiddushin, it says this: our masters taught that there are three partners in a person and in a relationship: the Holy One, a father, and a mother. So God, father, and mother. When a person honors his or her father and his or her mother, God says, I account it to them as though I were dwelling among them and they were honoring me. I want to pause. I'm going to do it one more time, but I want to give you the opportunity to just cluster up a little bit with the person next to you. And how do you make sense of that? Our masters taught there are three partners in a person and in a relationship: God, a father, and a mother. When a person honors a father or mother, it's God who says, I account it to them as though I were dwelling among them and they were honoring me. How do we make sense of that? What does that mean? We can actually do it. I'm looking at your faces. Let's do it all together. What does it mean? What do we learn from that? Yeah. So one is that it's just as important to honor your father or your mother as it is to honor God. I mean, that is huge. And so much so beautiful, and so much so that God takes a human being honoring a parent as if we were also extending honor to God through that act. What a beautiful, beautiful idea. We're going to go to the second one. Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana says, and this is also from the Talmud in a different source of Peah, Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana says that Scripture puts the easiest of commandments on the same level as the most difficult of ones. The easiest of commandments, according to Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana, is letting a mother bird go. The most difficult of commandments, honoring your father and mother. And with regard to each, he says, it is written that your days may be long. So again, we're seeing a positive consequence or a reward for honoring one's parents. But we're also seeing, according to Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana, that he believes it to be the most difficult mitzvah in the entire Torah of 613 mitzvot. He says that is the most difficult mitzvah. So let's go to the nitty-gritty. And one of the things that Rabbi Schwartz and I were talking about in our podcast this week, it is a podcast, isn't it? Yeah. Whenever I post on Facebook, I call it a blog, and my family's like, it is not a blog, you're posting on Facebook. So, podcast. Okay. So in the podcast that we were talking about was this idea of like, and Ben was there with us also this week, that oftentimes the Torah gives us sort of like, especially coming up next week in Mishpatim, like law after law after law, but the rest of the Jewish wisdom comes to fill it in. So in this source, what I'm going to be giving to you is Shulchan Aruch, which is Yoreh De'ah, and the section is what does it mean? It's about the regulations of honoring our parents. So here we go. It's necessary, again, according to the Shulchan Aruch, it's necessary to be very careful about honoring one's father and mother and about fearing them. In any case, the Beit Din does not compel with respect to the mitzvah of kibud av v'em, of honoring your parents, since it is a positive commandment and it gives its reward indirectly. So the question is, what is honor? Here we go. Providing a parent food and drink, right? What it means to honor someone. This is like what the mitzvah says. It says when you honor your father and your mother, that we know that's a mitzvah. So what does that mean? You need to provide food and drink to them. You need to dress and cover your parent. And you need to bring him or her in and out. Let's pause. So in some ways, we're clearly talking about a parent who is aged and unable to do some of these things for him or herself. And the responsibility then are what? To make sure they're eating and drinking, to make sure that they're clothed, right? They're like covered and clothed and dressed, and to make sure, this is very interesting, I think, that they're getting in and out. Why is that important? Has anyone been homebound? Not fun, right? Oxygen, air, right? Even in hospitalizations, we see the importance of getting in and out sometimes. So you are responsible to make sure that they're getting in and out. Let's keep on going. He should, or she should, a child should provide a parent with a pleasant face.
Wait, is that 100% of the time?
Yes. Actually, it's so true. And this is like one of my favorite ideas. A child should provide, I heard a snort from Howard. Okay. A child should provide a parent with a pleasant face, for even if he feeds him like a beautiful like food, it says crammed bird, but I'm going to say a beautiful food every day, while showing him an indifferent face, right? So it doesn't matter if you show up with like prime rib or, ribeye steak every day for your parent. If you do it with a face that looks like you're doing it begrudgingly, or like you're imposing, or you're like annoying, that actually is a problem, and you will be punished for that face. And so he says, it is true the opposite, says the Shulchan Aruch. It says, if you make him like something terrible, grind from the mill, but you're doing it with like love and your intention is for good, that will be rewarded. So the next part, I'm putting together pieces from the Shulchan Aruch. It says, how far does honoring one's father and mother extend? And by the way, this is a question I would say that like we hear a lot in different forms, and you'll see why soon. It says, even if a parent took the child's purse of gold coins and threw them into the sea in front of the child should not rebuke the parent and should not show pain before them and should not be angry at them, but should accept the enactment of Torah and just be quiet. Max says, whoa. And it actually, it's a really interesting thing, right? I mean, there are many reasons that a parent could be doing this to a child, and what might those reasons be? This is like real life stuff. Maybe to teach a lesson. What else could it be? Like, what parent teaches a child? Dementia. Sometimes, right, like as we age, there are different sort of neurological things that creep in that in sometimes, oftentimes, sort of change your character or your disposition, your personality. Sometimes it makes you angry or a little paranoid, or sometimes just not as patient. What else could this be about? It could be about a parent that you actually just don't have a good relationship with and who isn't nice to you, right? Who does things that are diminishing or sort of like mean-spirited. And again, what was this example? Your parent literally takes your money and throws it in the water. And in a case like this, and you could probably think of other cases where something happened to someone that you know per se, or maybe to you. And the answer is, like, according to Jewish law, if you want to honor your parent, you shouldn't rebuke them, you shouldn't yell at them, you shouldn't show pain, you shouldn't be angry at them, you just be quiet. And that's what it means to honor your father or your mother. Now, it goes a step further, and it says, one whose father or mother has become demented. Right? So we're actually going to talk about real stuff here. Right? We're not going to pretend that every person has a spectacular parent. Not everyone was given a spectacular parent. And we're also not going to pretend that everyone has their wits about them, at the end of their lives the way that they may have it earlier on. And it says, a person whose father or mother has become demented should try to behave with them according to their mental state until God has mercy on them, which is also really interesting, right? Until God comes for them and has mercy on them. If it's impossible for a child to bear because of their parents' altered condition, the child should go and leave the parent and appoint others to care for him or her as fitting. And this is actually really important and beautiful. If a child can't do it, here it's because the mental state of being is just too hard, because in this altered condition, it's just too challenging. Maybe it's abusive, maybe there's sort of something tormenting happening, right, consistently. Then even if a child has to, distance him or herself from the parent, according to the Shulchan Aruch, that is permitted, as long as you make sure that someone else is there to give that care to a parent. And that fulfills the obligation. And last, it says, if a person's father, and I love that they don't include mother here for the first time, told the child to transgress the words of Torah. So if they're telling you to do something that is like a sin, whether it's a positive commandment or a negative commandment or even a rabbinic commandment, guess what you should do? Not listen. It's the first time we see something that honor, but if they tell you to sin, you don't have to. In fact, you shouldn't. So I hope that in sharing these particular mitzvot, we're able to think about the way that not only we honor our parents, because the truth is many people might not have parents anymore in this world that they can still show that honor to. But I think the way that we guide, the way, God bless you, that we advise, and also the way that we think about how we as a society treat those who are our elders, and the way that we extend our care, because again, going back to the beginning of the Parsha, what we see is not only is it not good for human beings to be alone, but it's really hard. It's really hard to be alone, and it's really hard to feel alone. And so whether there are parents that we're honoring, maybe a neighbor, or maybe it's someone else in your world, just make sure, and maybe Yitro comes to remind us, that it's a lonely world out there. It's not how it's meant to be. And so anything that we can do to show a little bit of care or kindness or love to another, it's really a beautiful blessing, and I do believe it will be rewarded someday, either in the now or someday to come. And to that we can say Amen.
Amen.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say if you have an abusive parent, then the Shulchan Aruch gives us precedent to say you actually don't have to do that work yourself, right? You don't have to put yourself in a place where you are being abused, whether that's emotionally abused, verbally abused, physically abused, right? You do not need to be in that relationship in that way, but you do have an obligation still to just make sure that someone else is doing the what, making sure that your parent who is abusive and is difficult is fed and is drinking and is clothed and dressed and is going in and out. You need to make sure that their basic needs are being met. Yeah. And I think that's why, going back, why Rabbi Abba says it's the most difficult mitzvah. Because it's the even though, Susan. And I say this, when you have an extraordinary parent, it isn't the most difficult mitzvah to honor him or her. But when you have a parent that, in your eyes, wasn't not only an extraordinary parent, but even a good parent, that I think is what Rabbi Abba is talking about when he says it's one of the hardest mitzvot, or it actually is the hardest mitzvah. Yeah. Shabbat shalom.